Hello, and welcome back to the Teresa Santos Show with La Rosa Realty and La Rosa Realty Coaching, and the VIP group because I do all of those. But welcome back. Today we're going to train on one of the new writers. Okay, so one of the new writers that are related to the compensation and how that compensation is going to be disclosed when you are asking the seller for a possible concession or contribution to help pay for the buyer's compensation or the buyer's broker compensation for the buyer. Okay. I think I got that right. I know all these forms got me all confused, guys. I'm just as confused as you are sometimes with all these new forms being released, but I'm going to get into the training. I'm going to show you how that is going to be used and when you should use it. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And oh, and by the way, don't forget to share, like, and subscribe to my channel. There should be a subscription button around there somewhere or right below this video. But make sure that you subscribe because every time I give a class, every time I do a training on any of the forms, you're going to receive a notification so you can log in there and view the training so that you're not left behind waiting for other persons to teach you how to do this. Okay, that is what I am here for. And so make sure that you subscribe, like, and share and comment. If you have any questions, I do reply to the comments as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. And we're going to go over to one of the new writers that is called the comprehensive writer to the residential contract for sale and purchase, and it is a credit related to buyer's broker compensation. So this is the name of the form right here. Okay, the FF, credit related to buyer's broker compensation. So we're going to go ahead and go through this because I need you to understand that this is a writer that you are going to use when you are asking. Let's say the listing broker is not offering compensation, and you want to see when you make that offer, you want to negotiate to see if the seller is willing to pay compensation, either through a concession or a contribution or anything of that nature to help offset the what you're charging your buyer, basically, right? What you're charging your buyer. Okay. So that'll help when you're in negotiations, especially when they say we are not offering compensation. This is a way that you can negotiate that compensation as a concession of some sort and be able to disclose that part of that concession will be used for the buyer's broker payment. Okay. So for your compensation, if you're representing the buyer. Okay. So let's go into it and we'll go ahead and read it step by step. So if issued by all parties, the clauses below will be incorporated into the Florida Realtors Florida Bar residential contract for sale and purchase between. Now, let me also add, this is not a substitution for your EBA. So for exclusive buyer brokerage agreement, you still need that signed by your buyer. And remember that whatever compensation is on that EBA is the maximum that you can charge unless you do an amendment or a this modification to that agreement. Okay, so just keep that in mind when you're filling out this form. You're still going to need the EBA, and you're still going to need some sort of. This is basically like your compensation form when you're agreeing that this is what's going to be done with the money that the seller is going to pay as a concession to help offset either the closing costs of that client. And part of the closing cost to your buyer could be your compensation. Okay. All right. So we're going to go here between. Obviously, the seller is going to be there, right? We're going to put the seller's name. And because this is between the seller, not the listing broker, this is between the seller and the buyer. Okay. Or the buyer's brokerage. Okay. So we're going to put the seller, and then obviously we're going to put the buyer's informations in here. Okay. Then we're going to go concerning the property described as I always say, put the address, but also put the legal description down here. Okay. Why? Because if you make a typo on the address, remember these are contracts. The contracts have to be correct because if anything happens, they can go back and say you did it wrong or you did a typo. So make sure that you also put the legal description on this as well as the address. Okay, obviously we have the initials that are going to go here for the buyers and the sellers. Okay, as business as normal. So let's go ahead and credit related to buyer's broker compensation. Buyer has entered into a separate brokerage agreement. Remember, this is a writer and also almost a disclosure. The buyer has entered into a separate brokerage agreement, which is the EBA, the agreement between you and the buyer, as may be amended. So it's telling you right here that it could be amended, which means it could be modified if we need to. Okay. Oops, sorry. A buyer brokerage agreement. So it's telling you that what they have entered into a separate buyer brokerage agreement, which is not incorporated herein by this reference with, and then you're going to put here, insert the name of the brokerage. Okay. So here you would put whatever your brokerage name is, because the buyer brokerage agreement is between the buyer and the broker, and you would have to put the broker information there. Okay. At closing, seller agrees to credit the buyer the sums described below, which for disclosure purposes only the parties agree is related to the buyer's obligation under the buyer's broker agreement to pay all or a portion of the buyer's broker compensation. So this is telling you exactly that at closing, the seller agrees to credit the buyer, right? Not to credit you or the brokerage, but credit the buyer the sums described below, which for disclosure purposes only the parties agree is related to the buyer's obligation under the buyer's broker agreement to pay all or a portion of buyer's broker's compensation. What is that saying? It's just saying that basically they're agreeing, the buyer and the seller are agreeing that the seller is going to give the buyer a credit or a concession to in to help offset whatever fee you're charging your buyer to represent them. Okay. And it's just disclosing it. Here it's going to say, how much did that seller agree to do as far as compensation? Was it a flat fee that they say, I'm okay, I'm willing to give, a 2% concession, or I'm willing to give a $5,000 credit? Whatever it is, you can put the percentage of the purchase price. You can put a flat fee, right? The seller can agree to just pay $2,000 or pay 3,000 or 5,000, whatever it is, right? A flat fee or a percentage of the purchase price plus. Okay. The plus would be a bonus. Let's say the seller says, okay, well, I'll give the buyer, 2% of the purchase price plus, $1,000 as a bonus. Okay, for an example. Okay, if they give me a full price offer, right? So this is where you're going to put the compensation. Now, keep in mind, the compensation here should not be more, or it could be more, but you have to make sure that it at least covers your buyer's broker compensation. If it does not, then obviously it would be reduced by that. Okay. So if you're charging the, I don't know, you're going to charge them 3%, let's say, to your buyers as part of your compensation. And remember that, as I'm recording this is for educational purposes only. I am not an attorney, so I'm going to go ahead and reiterate that. You should have seen that disclosure at the beginning of this video. I am not an attorney. I'm not giving you legal advice. I'm going through this to try to teach you what and help for you hopefully understand when you're going to need this, okay? But all fees are negotiable. Whatever you decide to charge your buyer, your seller, that's totally up to you and your broker what your compensation is going to be. I'm just using these compensation numbers and percentages just so that you understand what I'm talking about, not because that's what I'm telling you to charge. Okay. Just to be clear that I am not trying to tell you what to do or your broker what to do or what to charge. Okay. So I'm just giving full disclosure. Again, I am not an attorney. This is for educational purposes only. All right. So here we're going to have, this information. Okay. It says, in the event the credit described above, there's a credit, right? Let's say 2%, 3%, $10,000, whatever. exceeds the amount allowed by the buyer's lender, okay, for such contributions, which you need to call, you make sure that you speak to the lender to see if there's any limits on how much contribution the buyer can receive when it comes to their loan. Then, to the extent permitted by buyer's lender, check one. If no box is checked, then the balance of the credit will be paid by seller directly to buyer's broker. Okay? So you would check that box, or the balance of the credit will be paid by seller directly to buyer's broker, or the credit will be reduced to the maximum amount allowed by buyer's lender. Now, this can be a little confusing, okay, because I've read it 3 times and I'm still a little confused, but I'm going to try to do my best to kind of get it together here. In the event the credit described above, so whatever you put here, exceeds the amount allowed by the lender for these contributions or for such contributions as closing costs, then to the extent permitted by the buyer's lender, right? Check one. If no box checked, then the balance of the credit will be paid by seller directly to the buyer's broker. So if there's, they're giving a certain amount of credit and the lender says, no, it can only be XYZ. So you have, X here, this is what the seller's willing to pay or contribute, but the lender says, no, this is the only thing that we can get. Then obviously that credit will either be returned back to the seller, right? Because it's only has a certain amount that you can do, but it's also letting you know that if then the balance of the credit will be paid by seller directly to the buyer broker, okay? If not, the balance of the credit will be paid by seller directly to buyer's broker, or the credit will be reduced to the maximum amount allowed by buyer's lender. So again, if the seller is willing to contribute more, but the lender says, sorry, that's too much, he can't contribute that much because of the loan, then whatever the seller agreed to here is going to be reduced and returned to the seller, okay, if the buyer's lender says it's too much, okay? In the event the credit described above exceeds the limit allowed by the buyer-broker agreement, then the credit will be adjusted to the amount allowed under the buyer-broker agreement as may be amended. So again, in the event the credit described above exceeds the limit, so if here it says a certain amount, right, and it's more than what you have in your buyer-broker agreement, then this is what's going to happen. You may amend it, right? Because you can do a modification and amend it. But if you don't, and you decide, that this amount exceeds what you're charging on the buyer broker agreement, the credit will be basically returned to the seller. Okay. It'll be adjusted, right? So even if they agreed to $10,000, I'm just going to use an example. And the buyer brokerage agreement, the compensation totaled $8,000. The other $2,000 would be returned, basically would be amended and returned back to the seller. Okay. This writer, FF, shall not modify the buyer broker agreement. This is not to change from the buyer broker agreement. If your buyer broker agreement says XYZ, this should say XYZ. Okay, unless they're willing to pay more, and then you can modify your buyer broker agreement. Okay, or any other compensation agreement made between the seller and the buyer, seller broker and or buyer broker. Nothing in this writer, FF, requires the buyer or buyer's broker to provide a copy of the buyer's broker agreement to the seller or the seller's broker. And I'm glad they came out with this right here, because I've been seeing listing agents or listing brokers request to see the buyer broker agreement, and that is none of their business. So if they ask you for that, I think you need to report them, because that is none of their business and you do not need to provide that. Your agreement with your buyer is your agreement with your buyer. It's not an agreement with the seller. It's not an agreement with the listing broker. It is between you and your buyer, and it's nobody's business except between the broker, your broker, and the buyer. Nobody needs to see that. Okay. The only one that might request that is your title company, so they know exactly what your compensation is going to be, or maybe the lender if they need to check on that contribution to make sure that it coordinates with what's allowed with the loan. Okay. Other than that, no listing broker, no listing agent should be asking you to disclose your buyer broker agreement. And if they do, report them. Tell them, can you send me that via text? Okay. If you're a listing agent watching this, please don't do that because that's not any of your business. Okay. Whatever agreement the buyer's broker has with their client is their business. Just like whatever the listing side is with the seller is their business. If the seller is only paying you a certain percentage and they're not contributing to the buyer broker, that's nobody's business but yours. Your buyer's broker is not going to ask you, well, how much is the seller paying you? Right? No, that is none of anybody's business. Okay. Now, you can ask if the listing agent, however, does need to disclose if there is compensation offered on their listing agreement to the buyer's broker, whether it be through the listing brokerage or whether it be through the seller. If it is on their listing agreement that there's going to be some compensation, the listing agent has to disclose that. Just so you guys know. And if they don't, or they say they're not sharing compensation, submit your offer and whatever, negotiate your compensation. Yes, you can do that, but your listing agreement must be checked on C in order for you to do that. Because if they checked A or B, meaning that they're going to pay the compensation is being paid by the listing brokerage, or the compensation is being paid, or some compensation is being paid by the seller, then that needs to be disclosed to the buyer's agent when they're calling you. Okay. That's all I have to say about that one. But anyway, I hope that you guys understood this. I know it was it was a lot, but hopefully that cleared up a little bit when you're going to use this. This is not a substitution for your EBA, your exclusive buyer brokerage agreement. You still need that to show homes and make offers and do everything else. This is just if the writer that you're going to need to use, if the seller is willing to give concessions after you negotiate your deal, right? Your as is. Once you negotiate that contract and they're willing to pay concessions, that part of those concessions, you would need this writer to disclose that part of those concessions are going to be used to pay the buyer's broker. Okay, for your compensation. So that is what this form is for, and that is when you're only going to need it. Only if you're asking for some concessions from the seller to cover your compensation if they were not offering compensation to begin with. If they're already offering compensation, then you have nothing to worry about. You're just going to need a compensation agreement that the seller or the listing broker is willing to pay the buyer's brokerage. If that's already been discussed and it's open and it's disclosed, you don't need this. But if they're saying, no, I'm not paying the buyer's broker, but I'm willing to give a contribution to help with closing costs, this is the form that you're going to need to have filled out so that you can get paid. Okay? So I hope that this helps. And please keep in mind on the as is contract, there is no compensation discussion. This is the writer that you're going to submit. You're not going to put on additional terms. Seller agrees to pay 3% or 6% concessions, and we can use it for, that'll be used for the buyer's broker compensation. No, it does not go in there. It goes notified on this writer. When you put the information on the bottom with your name and what your brokerage is on the as is, do not put a percentage next to that. Don't do that. You are not supposed to put the compensation next to your name or next to the broker of what you're expecting to receive. Do not put that on that contract. Remember, that contract is between the buyer and the seller, not between brokers. So there should be nothing related to brokerage compensation in that as is contract, because that contract is not between broker and broker. That contract is between buyer and seller. That's all I have to say about that. All right, guys, I hope this helped. Don't forget to share, like, comment, subscribe to this channel so that you can get updated on the new forms as they come out. I'm sure they're going to come out with new forms, like I said before. This is going to be an ongoing process. But once everything is strained out, hopefully we won't have any more classes on these forms, but you know where to find them on my YouTube channel. And as they release them and as they update them,